Hello. Welcome to another class in our blasting course. In today's class, we'll be talking a little bit about the history and evolution of civil explosives applied to rock blasting. So, let's go to today's class. The purpose of today's class is for us to understand a little about the history and evolution of civil explosives applied to rock blasting, and how this history and evolution of explosives has affected or still affects current models, both regarding explosives and accessories, as well as the rock blasting itself. We will see that the discovery of new explosives and the evolution of these explosives not only contributed to the rock blasting, but also contributed to the evolution of society and the evolution of the industry, and all this directly affects the practices that we have today. So, we need to understand a little bit of history to know what changed, why it changed, what benefit modern explosives bring when we compare them to the explosives that came before them. This is important for us to know the characteristics of explosives, and what is really important about them on a daily basis, which has already been evolved and which still needs to continue evolving. If we were to talk about the history of rock blasting itself, we would need a history expert, because rock blast is totally connected with the evolution of society, and with the evolution of human practices. We see that since the beginning, man already used rock, either to produce tools, or to produce weapons, or to produce shelters, houses, and to supply other needs. So, the history of rock blasting is connected with the history of mankind. With the man's evolution, he needed rock to build new constructions, and that's why we were able to contemplate the evolution of man, through the evolution of constructions and houses that were created, as well as the materials and tools they needed to make these constructions. We can also see this story by looking at how man learned to extract minerals from the ground, and use them in their daily lives, and all of this had a great impact on the evolution of our society. So, we can easily see how rock blasting already affects and contributes to society from the beginning, as we speak. I always say, rock blasting is the art that shapes the world. Because it's through rock blasting that we shape the earth, that is, we change the shape of the earth. We detonate the rock, take this rock from one place, and put it in another place. In the same way that, from this rock, we can extract the ore, and we transform this ore into equipment, utensils, tools, and we go on shaping the world. So, the rock blasting story is very important to our society. It's very long, it's not the target of our today's class, but it's important that we know that rock blasting is linked to our society, and that even the, let's say, more primitive techniques of rock blasting are many times can still be used today. Just as we have to know that its principles are the basis of current rock blasting. Here, we have the example of Mr. Rocks, in a report on the Uviter channel. Mr. Rocks works handcrafted, breaking stone, to sell for civil construction, to build houses or to make some small constructions, and he does it with just a few tools, and with his manual force, in the same way as prehistoric man did to remove and break the rock. He keeps doing that to this day, and that's how he earns his money to survive. So a technique that is thousands and thousands of years old, is still being used today, of course, in a little better way, with a little better tools, but it follows the same historical principles of rock breaking. In this video we can see a man who needs to remove the rock from a piece of land, probably to do some construction on the site, and as he had no other rock blasting techniques, he used a very old technique, which uses fire to heat the rock, and by this heating the rock expands and breaks little by little, where you continue removing the little pieces, as they break, so that you continue heating the rest of the rock, until it breaks completely. I encourage you to do a quick search on the internet, because there are several other videos like these showing some rock breaking techniques that are part of the history of the evolution of rock blasting, and of course, they are still present to teach us, to bring the basic principles of blasting, which is the fragmentation of the rock to use the rock, as is the case with Mr. Rocks here, where he is breaking the rock because he's going to use this rock in the construction, or else the case here in our second video where you're breaking the rock because you need to remove it to use the site. So, this is the basic objective of rock blasting, which is to fragment the rock to use the rock or to use its location. As we've already said, the story is very important, because it gives us lessons, it really brings us rock blasting characteristics that are still used today. We started the history of explosives, talking about black gunpowder, which was without a doubt, the beginning of the development of products that we know today as explosives, and that we use in rock blasting. There are several versions in history books, and on the internet, but most of them indicate that black gunpowder was developed by the Greeks, followed by the Chinese, and Arabs. Some versions will reverse the order, and will indicate that it was the Chinese first, and others that were the Arabs. But in general, we can conclude that these were this three who started using black gunpowder. At first, gunpowder was actually used to produce fireworks, to carry out pyrotechnic shows, and its basic formula was composed of 75% potassium nitrate, 15% coal and 10% sulfur. There is a report that more or less in the 14th century, a man named Schwartz was the first to make a mixture similar to that of the Chinese in Europe, and in this period the use of gunpowder for war purposes began more intensely. There are some reports that he was the one who developed the cannon through the use of gunpowder to launch an iron sphere. Although there is no precise date on which gunpowder was actually invented, it is known that for many centuries, gunpowder remained the only known explosive used by man for various purposes. So, we can say that we have gunpowder as the beginning of the history of explosives in all senses, both military explosives as well as civil explosives. Only almost 300 years later, in the 17th century, do we have the first record of the use of black powder in rock blasting. The year 1627 is the first record of the use of black powder in Hungary for rock blasting. After that, gunpowder began to be used more massively in the year 1670 by German miners, and we have the record of the first black powder factory in the United States, officially, in the year 1675, which from then on begins to actually spread black powder for use in rock blasting across North America. Only in 1696, at the end of the 17th century, we have the first record of the use of black powder for road construction, and thus we have the first record of rock blasting for civil works. Thus, we see that it was only in the 17th century that the use of explosives in rock blasting began to spread around the world. With this growth in demand, the use of black powder in rock blasting, there really began to be numerous accidents with the use of explosives. This led to the identification of the need to create safe initiation methods for explosives. It is at this point in history that we have the beginning of explosive accessories. We'll comment on this a little later, but it's important to link this story of accessories with black powder, because black powder really leaves us a great lesson, that not only do we need to have a good and safe explosive, but we need a method safe and efficient initiation. Black powder continued to be used for several centuries as the only explosive. Within his limitations, he was effective in what he did, but his initiation was very dangerous, so in parallel, it was realized that it was necessary to start developing initiation systems that were safe to initiate black powder. It started with goose feathers, paper straws, wooden tubes and several other attempts. So, all of this was used in a primitive way. They were the first attempts to determine a safe means of initiation of gunpowder, as it was realized that it was at the time of initiation where the greatest danger was, where the majority of accidents actually occurred. Until the year 1831, when William developed the safety fuse. The famous wick that we see light in movies, in dynamite and in barrels of black powder. This was the safety fuse, which we will see that he continues to use until today. So, the last contribution of black powder was to contribute with the first initiation system used in a safe way. That nothing else is, as we'll see, like a tube of gunpowder surrounded by a waterproofed varnished jute rope. Which is the one we light, and it burns slowly, until it reaches the end, where it starts the explosive. So, black powder, in addition to being the principle of using explosives, it brought a great lesson. That we need not only to focus on explosives, but we also need to focus on accessories, because we're going to see that they are sources of efficiency in our detonation, for the result of our blasting, just as they are responsible for the safety in carrying out our blasting. This is the great lesson that black powder leaves in the history of explosives. It's the need for a safe initiation for explosives. The second step in the history of explosives is linked with the discovery of nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin, which are compounds that have a high explosive power. Mainly nitroglycerin, which was discovered by an Italian chemist, who discovered that from glycerin, which was a byproduct of soap production, it could be nitrated and produce nitroglycerin. He noticed that it easily exploded through any shock, friction or impact it suffered, and with a power far greater than gunpowder. Then begins the story of the most powerful and modern explosives. So, with the discovery of nitroglycerin, the basis for development and research for more powerful explosives began. The big problem with nitroglycerin was safety. There were numerous accidents during manufacture, storage and handling. As we said, it is a very powerful explosive, but it is also very dangerous, as any sudden movement, any impact or friction can trigger the initiation of nitroglycerin very suddenly, and this has caused numerous accidents. But in the year 1863, we have the famous Alfred Nobel, who develops a mixture that stabilizes nitroglycerin, and he calls it dynamite. Which, together with gunpowder, are the two most known explosives we have in the history of society. So, now we know that Alfred Nobel invented dynamite, that's right. He's the same creator of the Nobel Peace Prize. A few years later, Alfred Nobel also developed the first detonator, composed of mercury fulminate, which was developed for dynamite initiation. So, he developed dynamite, which was a much more stable form than nitroglycerin, which, while much more dangerous than the modern explosives we have today, at the time was much more powerful than gunpowder and much safer than nitroglycerin. Dynamite was really an important discovery in the evolution of rock blasting. Besides this great contribution, Alfred Nobel also contributes with the second step of the initiation systems, which was the development of the mercury fulminate detonator, where we started to join the safety fuse, which has a slow burn, with the detonator that was more powerful, and this set started the dynamite. A few years after the invention of dynamite, Nobel evolved dynamite a little further, creating gelatinous dynamite, which is the basis for gelatinous explosives. This brought an extra safety component, as well as extra power to the dynamite. With this evolution of explosives, we have that in about 5 to 10 years, the amount of explosive consumed in rock blasting, both in mining and in construction, grew extraordinarily. There are historical reports that consumption has grown from 11 tons per year to almost 2,000 tons per year, an increase of almost 200 times. Almost 30 years later, in the year 1895, the year before Alfred Nobel died, he had already built 90 explosives factories in 26 different countries. So, the invention of dynamite provided a very big evolution in the use of explosives. Alfred Nobel was born in Sweden. He died in Italy in the year 1896. His father was an engineer and inventor, and dedicated his life to manufacturing explosives. He had numerous accidents in his history, lost a son, one of Alfred Nobel's brothers. And like his father, Alfred Nobel also pursued this career, and throughout his life, he has made a marked contribution to the history of explosives. When Alfred Nobel died, he left in his will all his fortune to the Nobel Foundation and instituted the Nobel Prize, that's right, the famous Nobel Prize, which we know today and which is so famous around the world. The Nobel Prize was created with money produced by the explosives factories. A fortune that Alfred Nobel made from the invention of dynamite and through the invention of the first detonator. So we see how explosives have made a remarkable contribution to the history of society. In addition, as we speak here, the Nobel Prize itself is one of the biggest prizes, perhaps the biggest prize, awarded to development, inventions and solutions for world peace. It was created with the money from the explosives. This is very important for us to see that explosives not only contribute to wars, not just the downside of using explosives. Explosives are of great importance in the evolution of modern society that we have today. This is very important, as it is knowledge that makes us reflect on how much the explosive is based on the history of our society. A big lesson that we learned from nitroglycerin and dynamite, and that we have to be aware of for our use of explosives today, is that it's no use just being potent, it's also necessary to be safe. We saw here that pure nitroglycerin is much more potent, it is a very strong explosive, but there was no safety in its use, so as pure nitroglycerin could not be used in a standard and safe way, it was necessary to develop a safe way for your use. As we have seen, gunpowder's contribution was the beginning of accessories, as there was no point in having an explosive if you couldn't start it correctly, this being the greatest contribution of gunpowder to the modern knowledge of the use of explosives in rock blasting. And the big lesson that dynamite and nitroglycerin leave behind is that it doesn't matter to be potent if it isn't safe. We need powerful explosives in rock blasting, but we need them to be safe. Here we have two videos, which are from the Inventions of History channel, which will give a little more detail on the history of the development of gunpowder and the history of the development of dynamite and the Nobel Prize. Here are the links, please visit, it is very interesting and very illustrative, and it details much more than what we said. I recommend it, because although gunpowder and dynamite are no longer massively used these days, maybe at some point you will have the opportunity to use it or find someone using it. But beyond that, they have a remarkable contribution, as we said, to the history of explosives, as well as to their evolution. So many lessons were learned from gunpowder, and the use of dynamite, and they were important in determining principles for the use of explosives in rock blasting. So, please watch the videos. There are several other videos, and as soon as we find them, we will add them to the complementary material of our classes, but in a quick search on the internet or on YouTube you will find other sources of information. We also ask that any extra curiosity you discover, or any additional information, please share with us. We will be very interested in discussing this topic with you, and sharing it with the rest of our course students. The third major step in the history and evolution of explosives was the discovery of the possibility of using ammonium nitrate in the manufacture of explosives. Ammonium nitrate has been known since the 19th century. It was already used as a fertilizer and for other purposes, but in the 20th century, it was discovered, through two accidents, that ammonium nitrate had properties to be the basis of explosive products that we know today. The first accident occurred in Germany in 1923, when an attempt was made, inside a ship, to break an amount of ammonium nitrate, approximately 4.5 tons, which had become paved, and dynamite was used to break this petrified nitrate, and the ammonium nitrate exploded along with the dynamite, causing this ship to be destroyed. A few years later, in 1947, there was an accident in Texas, in the United States, when two ships collided, one with diesel oil and the other with ammonium nitrate. Diesel oil was mixed with ammonium nitrate, and the fire from the collision of the ships increased, and reached this mixture, which eventually exploded. It was then discovered that ammonium nitrate, together with diesel oil, had even more explosive properties than pure ammonium nitrate. A few years later, around 1950, he had already started scientific investigations into the use of ammonium nitrate and managed to develop and perfect ammonium nitrate, giving it properties that made it the basis of explosives that we have it available in our day. So, the discovery of ammonium nitrate, for the production of ANFO, and for the production of the most modern explosives, which we know today, took place through these two accidents. Here, we have some photos and records of the second accident, that occurred in the United States, in Texas, where several people were injured, approximately more than 2,000 were injured, and 576 deaths were recorded. From the photos, we can see that it reached a large area, and several houses, that were close to the port. So, it really was a very serious accident, produced by the mixture of ammonium nitrate and diesel oil, which we now know as the famous ANFO, so used in rock blasting. The fourth step, or perhaps, what we can consider as the last landmark step, in the history of explosives, that we have until today. It was the dissemination or the beginning, of the massive use of ammonium nitrate, because in addition to producing ANFO, it came to be used to produce, and develop, the explosives we have today. Around the year 1958, we have the record of the first slurry explosive, which were mixtures of ammonium nitrate, diesel oil, water and some other components such as aluminum, gums, borax, etc., and that brought explosives that had great energy capacity, manufacturing flexibility, and became safer products to use. From the slurry explosive, water gels explosives were born, and a few years later, in Canada, in the year 1962, we have the first patents for explosive emulsions. And so, we have the two most energetic explosives we have available today, for use in rock blasting. So, the fourth step in the history of explosives, was the massive use of ammonium nitrate to develop the modern explosives we have today. And from then on, in fact, since the discovery of ANFO, the use of dynamite, and also the use of black powder, in rock blasting, began to decrease. These new explosives, based on ammonium nitrate, are starting to be developed exclusively for rock blasting, and are starting to gain more space, bringing a safety component, more efficient, and breaking work capacity. Several formulations were developed that made explosives safer and more efficient, which is what we have today. The main properties that we have in explosives today, compared to explosives such as dynamite and black powder, are safety, greater resistance, including water, greater storage resistance, longer latency period inside the hole, with a better chemical combination, and more stability of these products. These are the main characteristics that were necessary to develop in explosives, for us to get where we are. Before we continue with our class, doing just one finalization, to remember the importance of the history of explosives, we have the great contribution, the great discovery, that we can take as a lesson so far, with respect to ammonium nitrate, is that not everything is discovered by scientists, not everything is developed in the laboratory, but much comes from the practical part. That often fails to be developed in the laboratory, which is very important as we see, that the basis of modern explosives, was discovered through two accidents. So, we see that some of the great discoveries, in history, were not made from major scientific studies, or inventions, but they occurred from accident, or practical discoveries, And this brings us here a reflection on the importance of the practical process in rock blasting, because, without a doubt, the practical part brings knowledge that cannot be reproduced in the laboratory. Mainly because of the danger of massive use of explosives, as there is no way for you to detonate tons and tons of explosives for practical tests. It is very important that this remains a lesson, and that we can carry with us this historical knowledge of explosives. It's no use having an explosive that you can't start it safely. That was the great contribution of gunpowder. It's no use having a very powerful explosive if it's not safe to handle. If it's not safe to use, store it and its manufacture. This is the great lesson that we take from dynamite. And finally, with regard to ammonium nitrate, it is that not everything comes from scientific discovery and that the practical part of rock blasting is really important, and this elevates our theoretical knowledge, elevates our understanding, just as we'll see in the following classes on the use of explosives. As important as the history of explosives is the history of initiators or detonation accessories. As we saw, the great lesson that we had with gunpowder is that it is not enough to have only the explosive, be it powerful or not, but we also need adequate accessories for its initiation. That's why the history of accessories is also very fundamental for the rocks blasting. So, as we have seen, for several centuries black powder started to be used without having an efficient system of initiation. It was only in the 18th century that great attempts began. After numerous accidents, after the massive use of black powder, did we really begin to research more diligently and look for alternatives for safe initiation. Only in the 19th century, in the year 1830, we had the patent of initiation through the electrical energy of black gunpowder. Then there was the first remote initiation of black gunpowder, where there was the wire, which from a safe place, was conducted to the powder charge, and from there an electric current was given. This electrical current traveled through the wire and released an electrical spark that started the black powder. This being an excellent, safer initiation alternative than those that had been developed so far. A year later, William Bickford invented the first efficient and safe drive accessory, which was the safety fuse, which is like a flexible plastic tube with a black powder core. The gunpowder core was covered with plastic films, and this allowed it to start and have a longer burning time until it started the explosive charge. We've already seen this in older movies, where we see the famous explosives initiation wick. A few years later, around 1867, the famous Alfred Nobel invents the first detonator, composed of mercury fulminate, which consisted of a glass tube filled with mercury fulminate and black powder, which was started through the safety fuse and started the dynamite. After a few more years, in the 20th century, mercury fulminate was replaced by lead azide, which is still used today in the production of detonators, as a primary explosive for initiation. In the year 1913, already in the 20th century, we have the development of the detonating cord, by Cordeau. The name is complicated, but it was Cordeau who developed the famous detonating cord, which was based on a TNT core. A few years later, in 1937, the pent was developed, which we have used until today, replacing TNT as the core of the detonating cords. In the year 1946, the first delay capsules were developed, the short delays in milliseconds. In the year 1973, we have the development of shock tubes, non-electric initiation systems, by the company Nobel. And in the year 1980, about 40 years ago, we had the first tests with electronic detonators. So, these here are the main steps that we take in the development of accessory systems that are available today. So, in short, the first big step was the development of the safety fuse, which was the first safe initiation system developed exclusively for the initiation of black gunpowder, and then, in 1837, we have the second step of accessories, which was the development from the first detonators, by Alfred Nobel. Then follows the evolution of detonators, through the electric detonator, creating the delays for the detonators. Then, we have the invention of the detonating cord, followed by the fifth step, which was the invention of the non-electric system, the shock tube system, which came to replace the electric detonators, to replace the safety fuses, and finally we had the development of the electronic detonators, from the 80s. It is interesting to see that all these evolutions, of course improved and perfected, are still used today. The safety fuse is still being used today. The electric detonator, despite being little used, because of the risk of initiation by erratic currents and static energy, still exists in some operations that use the electric fuse. The detonating cord plays a fundamental role today in rock blasting. The shock tubes, the non-electrical system, which is perhaps the system, together with the cordel, most used for detonation. And finally, the electronic system, which despite having been developed 40-odd years ago, is still evolving. And despite being a widely used system, which is the most modern we have today, in initiation systems, they still haven't been able to completely replace the other initiation systems, due to the costs and the necessary resources. Of course, the oldest ones, such as safety fuses, are starting to be used less and less, and today their use is basically limited to the initiation of blasts, and no longer, to the initiation of holes or sequencing, and probably in a few years, we will not use them anymore, but they have their importance in the history of explosives, and initiation accessories. Therefore, at any time that is pertinent, we will be recalling the history of explosives, recalling their characteristics, and why they were replaced, why they needed to evolve, and what practical characteristics affect our daily lives. So, here's just this class as a summary, so that we can get an idea of the evolution of explosives, and why it was necessary for them to evolve, so that they could be used, in a safer, and more efficient way, in our daily lives. So that's it. We thank you for this class. Please, for any inquiries, we always leave our contacts here. Please feel free to contact us. There are also comments from the class, we respond whenever you have any questions. Anything else you want to share, any extra information, material and experiences that you would like to share with other friends and colleagues who are here with us on this course, please feel free to send us, and we will be very happy to exchange some ideas and share that with the rest of the staff. That's it. Thank you, a big hug, and see you next class.